On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, with the help of UK author and podcaster Paul Driscoll and Brazilian YouTube host Eric Fraga, we take a look at Sega's first entry into the worldwide home console market with the 1986 launch of the Sega Master System. Sega Games Company Limited can trace its roots all the way back to 1940, when three American businessmen in Honolulu founded Standard Games to supply military bases in the Pacific with electromechanical amusement machines during World War II. After the war, the company was sold off, but just a few years later, founder Martin Bromley and his father Irving Bromberg created Service Games to essentially continue the same business model, taking advantage of increased military activity due to the outbreak of the Korean War. In 1951, the passage of the Johnson Act outlawed coin-operated gambling devices on military bases inside the United States, and Service Games moved its headquarters from Hawaii to Tokyo and focused on providing machines to local U.S. military bases as well as private Japanese buyers. David Rosen was a Korean War veteran who fell in love with Japan after spending significant time there during the war. Rosen moved to Japan in 1954 and transformed his existing company Rosen Enterprises into an exporting and manufacturing business. In post-war Japan, every citizen was required to carry a photo ID card, and Rosen saw an opportunity to import instant photo booths to allow people to quickly create needed pictures. Rosen had an instant hit on his hands and was soon looking for ways to expand his business. With the Japanese people beginning to have more disposable income with the revival of the country's economy, Rosen began importing older coin-operated amusement machines from the United States, and games like Seeburg's Shoot the Bear were popular with Japanese consumers as guns had been outlawed at the conclusion of the war. In the late 1950s, Service Games began manufacturing their own coin-operated machines under the brand name Sega. At the same time, David Rosen saw his market share beginning to slip due to increased competition and proposed a merger with his friendly competitor. In 1965, the two companies merged, forming Sega Enterprises Limited, with Rosen installed as the CEO. The following year, Sega produced their first internationally successful arcade game, Periscope, which cost a then whopping 25 cents per play. In 1969, Sega was purchased by international conglomerate Gulf and Western for the modern equivalent of $62 million, with Rosen remaining as CEO. Sega prospered during the arcade boom that began in the late 1970s, producing absolute classics like Zaxxon and Monaco GP. In 1979, Sega bought a Tokyo-based arcade game distribution company called Esco Trading, owned by Hayao Nakayama, who, much like David Rosen, would be an instrumental figure within Sega for years to come. In the early 1980s, in an attempt to diversify due to slumping arcade sales, Sega decided to enter the home video game market, and in 1983 released its first home video game console, the SG-1000. The hardware was designed around a Zilog Z80 processor and has a palette of just 16 colors. The SG-1000 accepts both cartridges and the Sega MyCard, which has a reduced storage capacity and as a result sold for less than cartridge-based titles. The launch of the SG-1000 was unfortunately timed, both in that more broadly it coincided with the American home video game crash, eliminating the US as a potential market, and more specifically in that it launched at the same time as Nintendo's first home console, the Famicom. While the SG-1000 was a commercial underperformer selling about 2 million consoles worldwide, it is noteworthy as providing the platform for legendary game developer and father of Sonic the Hedgehog Yuji Naka's very first game at Sega. Due to declining revenue, Gulf and Western split the company up, selling the American assets to Bally in late 1983, while the Japanese side of the company was purchased by a group of investors led by Rosen and Nakayama. In 1984, the SG-1000 was cosmetically redesigned and dubbed the Mark II, the most notable change probably being the integration of a card slot, eliminating the need for a card catcher. The design of both the console itself and the controllers laid the groundwork for Sega's next home console, which was released the following year. In 1985, Sega released the Mark III.
Sega Mark III 新発売
Like the 1000, the Mark III's hardware is based around the Zilog Z80, but the amount of both system RAM and video RAM were greatly increased. The console uses a custom video processor based on the Texas Instruments TMS9918, which can display up to 32 colors on screen at once from a total palette of 64 and has a display resolution of 256 by 192. The only area in which the Mark III's hardware lags behind the Famicom is sound. Sega's system uses an off-the-shelf Texas Instruments 4-channel programmable sound generator, while the Famicom has a more advanced 5-channel chip. But Sega released an external FM sound unit for the Mark III containing a Yamaha YM2413 FM chip that made compatible games sound head and shoulders above the competition. While this was never officially made available for the North American Master System, it is possible to modify the console to add FM functionality. The Mark III was never released outside of Asia, but did sell almost 1 million units, which, while nowhere near the number of consoles sold by Nintendo, was also nothing to sneeze at. Due to the resurgent American home video game market, Sega decided to try exporting the Mark III to the United States, creating Sega of America in March of 1986 with David Rosen as its first CEO. Sega completely redesigned the Mark III and gave it a new name, the Sega System. This design still featured both a cartridge and card slot, 2 controller ports, and both an RF out and a multi-AV jack that outputs monaural sound along with both composite and analog RGB video. The Sega System made its press debut at the 1986 Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. The system was on store shelves in time for the Christmas shopping season, and 2 bundles were available at launch. The $100 Sega base system included the console with a combo cartridge featuring Hang-On and Astro Warrior, while consumers could also purchase the console with a light gun and a combo cartridge featuring Hang-On and Safari Hunt for about $30 more in a deluxe bundle called the Sega Master System.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers. And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The console was of course still competing with Nintendo's Famicom, which had been released in North America the previous year as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Sega System would go on to sell 125,000 units in 1986, but this paled in comparison to the 1.1 million systems sold by Nintendo. Although technically superior to the NES, the Master System was hampered by a lack of third-party developers due to Nintendo's restrictive licensing agreements, and Sega only moved about 2 million units in North America, compared to 34 million systems sold by Nintendo. To make matters worse for Sega, in their home country they re-released the Mark III under the new Master System design, and it fell just as flat as its predecessors. While the Nintendo Entertainment System almost single-handedly revived the home video game market in North America and was a cultural icon in the late 80s and early 90s, here the Sega Master System has, perhaps unfairly, been relegated to an esoteric or cult status. But in other parts of the world, the system didn't just compete, it absolutely dominated.
In the early and mid-1980s, home video games in the United Kingdom were for the most part played on home computers rather than video game consoles. This was due to a combination of companies like Atari being slow to move into that market, and the government in the UK pushing computer literacy in schools.
I bet there's hardly a pub in the country which doesn't have a couple of computers in the lounge bar.
This resulted in the UK following a very different path to the US in terms of video games, with its emphasis on tape-based home computers such as the Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amstrad and BBC Micro. While for a few years video games all but disappeared from the American cultural landscape, in the UK they were flourishing thanks to the market penetration of these educational home computers. In 1986, the Sega Master System was released in North America. By this time, the graphics in the popular home computer platforms, such as the Spectrum, was beginning to look aged. And people there were hungry for better graphics and sound. So in early 1987, the hugely popular British budget software publisher Mastertronic approached Sega about distributing the console in the UK, seeing an opportunity to seize the British home console market with a relatively low-cost system capable of much higher quality ports.
Do me a favour, plug me into a Sega.
The Master System made its debut in 1987 at the Personal Computer World Show in August and was on store shelves soon after. The machine, costing only £99, came bundled with the popular Sega arcade classic Hang-On, which came built into the console. By the end of the year, over 20 games were available for the system. Such highlights were the side-scrolling beat-em-up Black Belt and the excellent Spy Hunter clone Action Fighter. Due to diminishing budget software sales on the 8-bit micros, Mastertronic's revenue had begun to decline in 1987, and the Master System was perhaps the brightest star in the company's portfolio. Seeing an opportunity to expand into the growing home console market in the UK, Virgin's Richard Branson, who already owned a minority share of the company, purchased Mastertronic outright, merging it with Virgin Games. With little competition from Nintendo, a price point equal to the ZX Spectrum, and an aggressive marketing campaign, the Master System was able to slowly eat away at the dominance of the 8-bit home computer systems in Britain, and later the wider European video game market.
Sega Master System 2 Plus, con Alex Kit in memoria e una cassetta gioco inclusa.
So popular was the Master System in Europe that it received a number of PAL-only releases, including exclusive ports of arcade hits like Gauntlet and Forgotten Worlds. Not to mention console exclusive hits such as Master of Darkness. The Sega Master System would go on to sell 6.8 million units in the European market, accounting for over half of the worldwide sales. So successful were Virgin Mastertronic at marketing the Master System that they were bought out by Sega in 1991, and so they became Sega of Europe.
To talk about the Master System in Brazil, we need to first go back to Atari and the arcades. We Brazilians played a lot of arcade games. We loved games like Nenko's Pole Position and Rally X, which was renamed here to Stock Car by Taito do Brasil, probably the biggest pinball and arcade games distributor here in the 1980s. Also, many Sega games were in the arcades here, and I was lucky enough to play Altered Beast, Afterburner, Golden Axe and Shinobi. The actual experience of playing those games in the arcade back then feels to me like being in heaven. Next to my Atari 2600 games at home, the Atari 2600 came to Brazil in 1983, the year of North America's video game crash. For us, that year was just the beginning of home consoles. The Atari 2600 brought Missile Command and Pole Position into our homes, along with original games like Pitfall and Enduro. I loved my Atari, but that Sega, that Japanese touch was not there. Before Master System itself appeared here, there was a very small home computer market, basically dominated by clones of the ZX Spectrum, the, as we call it here, TK90X, TK90X, was the one I played at a friend's. But the MSX computer was launched here before the Master System, and that computer was big. Probably the most popular home computer in Brazil before the IBMs took over. I had many friends who had it, so I played a lot of Konami games like Nightmare, Goonies, and somehow got used and started to love, without realizing of course, the Z80 processor and the PSG sound and music. Then, at the very end of the 80s, Tectoy released the Master System, along with TV ads, magazine ads, and all that. I got mine for Christmas in 1989 with Alex Kidd in Miracle World, besides Hang On and Safari Hunt that was built, and of course the Snail Maze game that we called here in Brazil Jogo do Labirinto Secreto, meaning just Secret Labyrinth Game. Tectoy released the Master System, making it sound like a premium device for us in Brazil, because at the same time the NES and Famicom clones started selling here. There was a lot of models and makers, just too many to list here, but also there was just one problem. Not one of them was an official Nintendo product. On the other hand, they were a little bit cheaper than the Master System, which kind of helped its image as a premium console. The build quality and presentation also helped because Tectoy was mostly importing parts from Japan and assembling them here with some changes. The most notable change, I think, was not having the multi-AV out and instead the direct composite outputs, which was okay for us because all of our TV sets were composite or RF only at that time anyway. It's also not NTSC, it's PAL-M, which actually is more like NTSC than European PAL, apart from the acronym. The Master System gave us Brazilian players who came from the Atari 2600, arcades, and a bit of MSX, games like World Grand Prix, a very simple racing game that was very smooth, had a nice and clean presentation, and those Namco's pole position arcade colors. That was awesome for a gamer like me who hoped to have this kind of smooth gameplay at home. And keep in mind that we Brazilians loved simple racing games. Enduro from Atari 2600 was one of the most successful games here in the 80s. Maybe it's Ayrton Senna's fault, we'll never know. But the Master System was so much more than that for us. It was the Sega arcade conversions. For gamers who actually played Altered Beast and Golden Axe in the arcades, we knew that we could not have the same experience at home. But even with the low frame rate, the games actually looked like the arcade original, had the same music and almost the same gameplay. The Master System did not have the huge library that the NES had, but Tectoy managed to release most games and Sega did its part without Konami, Capcom and all those great Japanese companies, because as we all know, they were only allowed to develop for the NES. Of course, I missed games like Castlevania and Zelda on my Master System, but Master of Darkness and Golvelius were filling this void. Later came Phantasy Star, for which Tectoy even released a fully translated version. And it did not stop there. Ultima 4, a Sega conversion from a landmark RPG, I was lucky enough to get that game and remember being so puzzled by it. It was not translated like Phantasy Star, but by that time I was learning English just to play Master System RPGs and adventure games. All those type of games were available officially for us, thanks to Sega really working hard on porting and developing games across all genres and Tectoy releasing most of them here in Brazil. And guys, that's the story of the Master System in Brazil. To us, it's just one of the best home consoles of all time.
The Sega Master System was on store shelves here in North America in September of 1986. In addition to the combo cartridges included with the two system bundles, 5 standalone games were immediately available at launch. Choplifter, World Grand Prix, and Fantasy Zone were released on Sega's Mega Cartridge media, with Transbot and Ghost House released on Sega cards. Lastly, there was a hidden game on the console's system ROM called Snail Maze, accessible by pressing up and both buttons on the controller when starting up the system without a cartridge inserted.
Sega. Hot hits today, hot hits on the way. Plug into today's hottest arcade hits, like Afterburner and Alien Syndrome, with even more red-hot arcade hits on the way, like Shinobi, Thunderblade, and 2-player Double Dragon. The fun keeps coming at you, only from Sega. Hot hits today, hot hits on the way.
The pack-in game common to both the base and Master System, Hang On is a port of a 1985 arcade hit by Sega AM2 and celebrated game designer Yu Suzuki. While the arcade machines featured analog controls and either handlebars or a motorcycle chassis to sit on, which was revolutionary in 1985, this home version obviously depends on digital controls using the Master System controller. The game scrolls smoothly and features a vibrant color palette, which is used to give a unique look to each of the 5 areas in every course. The game has 8 such courses, which have differing layouts but the exact same environments. If you at any time touch either one of the opposing riders or items on the side of the road like bushes, cactuses, or light poles, you perish in a fiery inferno, losing precious seconds in the process. There is no in-game music, and although the sound effects are good, part of your bike's engine noise cuts out whenever you're passing or being passed by another rider. Probably due to the limited number of sound channels in the stock PSG chip. This home version of Hang On is both a fun game and a respectable port of the arcade hit, all things considered. Were it the standalone pack-in game for the system, as it was in the UK, it might be a bit of a letdown due to the lack of any real replay value, but thankfully here in North America, you got a 2-game combo cartridge regardless of which system you bought. Available only as part of the base bundle, Astro Warrior is a vertically scrolling space shooter that was specifically developed for the home market. When the game begins, your ship, the Astoro Raider, is cumbersomely slow and has a little pea shooter for a weapon. Grabbing power-ups that float down the screen both increases your speed and adds firepower. You can also pick up little helper ships just like the options in the Gradius series. Astro Warrior has good sound effects and catchy music, and once again takes advantage of the Master System's expanded color palette. There's an interesting variety of enemies, but the end-level bosses are much too easy to defeat, and the entire game is only 3 levels long, cycling back to the beginning ad infinitum. The Hang-On Astro Warrior combo cart was never made available in Europe, as the game was instead paired with action puzzler Pit Pot. Uninspired as it may be, it's still a decent pack-in game, especially as part of a 2-pack. The gameplay is certainly primitive compared to later shooters of the 8-bit generation, but for a 1986 launch title and pack-in freebie, much like Hang-On, it's good for some short-term fun. Paired on the cartridge with Hang-On in the Master System bundle was Safari Hunt, a light gun game that was ostensibly Sega's answer to Nintendo's Duck Hunt. Speaking of light guns, the Sega Light Phaser, which was both packaged in with the Master System bundle and subsequently available as a separate purchase, worked on the same principle as the NES Zapper. Although I have both heard and read it stated that the design of the Light Phaser was based on the Sega co-produced anime series Red Photon Zillion, the reverse is actually true, with the cartoon being designed so as to tie back into Sega's hardware. A total of 13 games were made for the Light Phaser, including Gangster Town, and a port of Taito's arcade hit Operation Wolf that was never released in the United States. Much like Duck Hunt, in Safari Hunt you have to shoot a requisite number of animals in each stage in order to move on to the next. The 3 levels in the game take place in lake, forest, and jungle settings, and each have their own variety of prey to shoot. The trio of levels just loops, so you're playing for high score rather than to complete the game. As early 8-bit light gun games go, this one certainly compares favorably, but as I've just never been able to get into the genre, Safari Hunt is still pretty forgettable for me, and I suspect that the 10-year-old version of myself would have been much happier with the base bundle's included games. Choplifter was originally programmed by Dan Gorlin and released by Broderbund on the Apple II in 1982. Due to its popularity, the game was subsequently ported to just about every other home computer platform, including the Commodore 64, which is where I first played it. In 1985, Sega created a coin-op version of the game for their System 1 arcade hardware, sometimes referred to as the Sega System 8. It was this version of the game that was in turn ported to the Mark III and Master System. In Choplifter, you take the role of a combat helicopter pilot. However, rather than the objective of the game being to shoot as many enemies as possible, your goal is actually to save prisoners of war. You take off from a landing pad that seems uncomfortably close to enemy lines, and land near enemy strongholds to allow prisoners to board the helicopter. In doing so, you become a sitting duck, meaning that you'll often need to take off and attack approaching enemies in order to protect both yourself and the defenseless prisoners. Being that it's based on the updated arcade version of the game, the Master System's Choplifter looks quite a bit better than the earlier home computer and console versions, aided by both the variety between levels and the Master System's expanded color palette. This version of the game also expands upon the original, with levels taking place over land and sea, and even in caves. Choplifter provides great arcade action with a unique twist, and the only real criticism that I can level at the game is that it's frustratingly difficult. But in my opinion, that's where arcade games got their replay value back in the day, and Choplifter is absolutely worth the challenge. The first of 2 games released at launch on Sega Card, Transbot is a horizontally scrolling shooter that was specifically developed for the Mark III, where it was released as Astro Flash. Ostensibly, the game was inspired by then-popular TV show and toy line Transformers, and in fact the game was ported to Sega's System E arcade hardware, on which it was released in the West as Transformer. Maybe Transformers weren't popular in Brazil, as this game was released there as Nuclear Creature. Transbot uses a randomized power-up system that frustratingly gives you limited-use advanced weapons, or just turns you into a flying robot, enlarging your hitbox accordingly. The game isn't horrible, but it's certainly unremarkable, and was easily the weakest of the 3 shooters available at launch. World Grand Prix was the other racing game initially available for the Master System, this time loosely based on Formula 1 Grand Prix racing. If not a proper sequel, the game is at the very least a spiritual successor to the 1985 SG-1000 and MSX game GP World, which itself was a home conversion of a 1984 arcade game. Rudimentary as they may be, the game at least tries to mimic real-world Grand Prix circuits, and while the game never actually tells you in which country each race is being held, it's often easy enough to figure out based on the colorful background graphics specific to each circuit. The game has the same sound limitation as Hang-On, but once again it's a minor annoyance at best. On the surface, World Grand Prix might seem similar enough to Hang-On to make one wonder why anyone would buy it, but this game has a wider variety of levels, the ability to upgrade your car, and perhaps most importantly a built-in track editor, which was actually a carryover from the aforementioned GP World. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to save your tracks due to the lack of any kind of battery backup, but this was back in the days when I was using a pen and paper to map out dungeons in role-playing games, and one could easily do the same here. Whether or not the game is worth visiting today is up for you to decide, but I can easily see my childhood self spending a Saturday night sleepover with a friend, designing and challenging each other with increasingly ridiculous custom-designed circuits. The other game initially released on card was Ghost House, which was also the sole platform game available at launch. The game certainly has its own charm, but ultimately is fairly shallow and repetitive compared to later platform games of the 8-bit era. I feel like a broken record saying that Ghost House has colorful graphics, so I guess I really just like the Master System's color palette. The gameplay, however, can be rather frustrating, which isn't helped by the fact that the jump and attack buttons are backwards compared to most platformers. This game was released in Brazil by Tectoy as Choplifter vs. Dracula, Choplifter referring to El Choplin Colorado or the Crimson Grasshopper, who was the main character in an eponymous Mexican comedy TV series from the 1970s and who was also the inspiration for the Simpsons character Bumblebee Man. This version is basically a graphical hack of the original, replacing the main character Mick with Choplin and changing some of the background elements, but also swapping the jump and attack buttons, making this the more playable of the two versions. Ghost House is the kind of game that, had I owned it in 1986, I would have played it just because I had it, but it was certainly nothing more than weekend rental material. Three of the 8 Sega Master System launch titles were arcade ports, and all 3 were originally released on different arcade platforms. Hang-On was developed on purpose-built hardware, and Choplifter was a Sega System 1 release, while Fantasy Zone was released on Sega's System 16, the newest of the 3 platforms and the basis for the hardware design of the Sega Genesis. Fantasy Zone was designed by Yoji Ishii, who also developed the 1984 arcade hit Flicky, directed both Hang-On and Outrun alongside designer Yu Suzuki, and later produced notable Saturn titles including Panzer Dragoon and Burning Rangers. Fantasy Zone is one of the original games in a subgenre that has come to be known as Q-'em-ups. Other examples include 1985's Twin Bee by Konami, and the famously expensive Magical Chase by Palsoft on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16. Ishii was tasked with designing a game to compete with Konami's arcade hit Gradius. But not wanting to create a straight knockoff, he chose to use a pastel color scheme and a hand-drawn graphical style. Drawing from his experience creating Flicky, he also chose to use a free-scrolling rather than fixed-scrolling design, reminiscent of arcade classic Defender. In Fantasy Zone, you take control of Opa Opa, a sentient spaceship trying to save its world, the Fantasy Zone, from alien invaders. In each level, you need to destroy the 8 alien bases, triggering a boss battle. Vanquished enemies drop coins, which can be used to buy limited-use weapons and ship upgrades, and even extra lives, from a shop that periodically appears in each level. I know I just got done saying how much I like the Master System's color palette, but admittedly I'm not a fan of the color scheme in this first level of the game. While it looks great in the arcades, the Master System's comparatively limited color palette make it a look that was difficult to replicate at home. Thankfully, the rest of the levels in Fantasy Zone look gorgeous. The game's catchy and upbeat soundtrack was composed by Hiroshi Kawaguchi, who also composed the music for Hang On, Space Harrier, Afterburner, and the musically iconic Outrun. The game's cuteness belies its difficulty, and unlike Astro Warrior, this is probably not a game that you're going to immediately finish and grow tired of. What it is, however, is a much more rewarding gameplay experience, and it was by far my favorite game to play for this episode. Were I buying a Master System at launch, I think I would have opted for the base bundle, having no real interest in light gun games, and would have grabbed Fantasy Zone and World Grand Prix to sink my teeth into once I was done playing Hang On and Astro Warrior. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, but before we go, I want to give a huge thanks to my two guests who helped make this episode a success. Paul Driscoll is a published author and co-host of the RGDS podcast, and his first book, Press Start, The Birth of Video Games Before 1977, is available on Amazon. Eric Fraga hosts the Brazilian YouTube channel Cosmic Effect. Now, it's all in Portuguese, but a video he made chronicling the design and construction of his Super Console is worth checking out whether you understand the language or not. Eric is also a talented electronic musician, and you can check him out on soundcloud.com/Cosmic Effect. As for us, you can always keep track of us between episodes on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or our website, cgquarterly.com. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Oh, and Chris, by the way, nice Ayrton Senna hatch on that Sega Saturn episode.